delighted to be joined by 4 expert voices for this session. So we have Liz McCarthy, who is CEO of Scale Island, which is the policy voice for high-growth tech startups and scale-ups. And prior to setting up Scale Island, Liz held a variety of roles at Startup Hub Dogpatch Labs, and she's also worked at 2 fintech startups. And next we have Petris Zilgalvis, who's head of unit for digital innovation and blockchain in the European Commission. And his unit also includes Startup Europe. And he's also co-chair of the European Commission's FinTech Task Force. And we have Andris Berzins, who's managing partner of Change Ventures, which is a seed fund focused on backing Baltic founders. He's played a key role in developing the Baltic ecosystem for over a decade. And before that, had a career as an executive across US, UK, and Israeli startups. And finally, Gloria Bauerlein, who's VP of the German Startup Association, which is the policy voice of the German ecosystem. And she's also COO of BAC, a Berlin software startup. And I can also say prior to that, when you go back in her career, she was also a colleague of mine for 3 years when she was an investor at Index. And it's nice today to actually be able to say I know all 4 panelists, which is rare and very nice. So we're a little family here. Anyway, I'm going to crack straight into our questions. And Gloria, I thought I'd kick off with you. So I wanted to ask, is there really a talent bottleneck in Europe? And if so, why? Given we produce more technical graduates in the US, we have a smaller tech sector, but we always hear that we still have a talent bottleneck. So, is this true? And how do you experience it?
I think there's always a talent bottleneck. And if you ask global entrepreneurs, they will always tell you the number 1 priority is finding and hiring talent, right? But actually, I think there is no bottleneck specifically in Europe. It's not a European specific problem. I actually think it could be a European advantage. Because as you alluded to, there are about 6 million developers, professional developers in Europe, whereas there are only about 4 million in the US. Germany alone has 50% more developers than whole of Silicon Valley. So I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem lies somewhere else. I think there are probably 2 main challenges. One is access to experienced talent that have experience scaling technology companies. We're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. So having experience with how to do things, how to scale a software company is really, really important. And I think that's a bottleneck today. And the other one is really a willingness to take risks. How can we solve that? We can solve that by making the prerequisites to attract talent as simple as possible, such that we can attract people that have experience over from the US, over to Europe, and really either start companies here or help scaling companies here. And we can do that by creating an European ecosystem that works together and exchanges ideas, shares best practices, rather than really working separately. So as you know, I've worked in London, Stockholm, and Berlin, and I'm starting to see that there's not really a lot of connection between the different ecosystems. So I really think we can improve there. And we can also encourage people to take more risks and tell the success stories of companies to make people really want to join startups and really innovate or drive innovation rather than joining BMW or Mercedes in our case.
Sure. Thank you very much, Gloria. And Andris, how's that talent bottleneck that Gloria described been a challenge for startups that you've worked with in the Baltic region?
Yeah, so as Gloria said correctly, talent is a bottleneck everywhere. In some sense, we're not unique, but there are some certain things that are a little bit different in Europe. So versus the experience I have in the US with Israel, especially. So in continental Europe, there's traditionally been many more people from the IT industry working in salaries in larger corporations. And so much more of a focus on salaries and options is a relatively new thing. That's changing. And what changes it is the big success stories you see that Neil Reimer was talking about, the Spotify success and so forth, which is inspiring people that there could be value to this. So even the lowly programmer who's maybe getting a small stock option grant is actually now thinking about it differently, that may potentially actually have some value someday. And so that is having a different effect on how people are thinking about their compensation. So naturally, they're asking
Yeah.
the questions. All right, so here, am I getting the same kind of advantages that Silicon Valley programmers or UK programmers would get, say? And so that's what's driving the question around stock options. And for our region, especially, one of the key challenges is we need to import talent as well. So as Gloria correctly said, experienced talent is in most demand. And in this region, we have some really great success stories, but still not that many. And so especially getting experienced talent here, having good stock option packages is a key part of that sort of conversation with that talent.
Absolutely. And Liz, how does what Andrea said resonate for you in thinking about the Irish ecosystem by comparison?
Well, agreed with everything Andrew said. It's something that isn't on the radar for a lot of employees that startup founders are looking to attract. Oftentimes it isn't a big part of the conversation. So I think that's where the policy needs to change first in order for those startups to be able to offer well-structured packages that can attract that kind of talent. But here in Ireland, the kind of experience we have is we actually have an awful lot of talent on our doorstep. A lot of people have come to work for very large multinationals. To Gloria's point, there's a difference between talent that has no experience and talent that has experience. But for our startup and scale-up sector, attracting those kind of people from those multinationals who can offer very significant compensation packages is a challenge for startups. You really have to work hard to sell that opportunity. And that's where generally the share options piece can be a huge tool for our startups to be able to attract that kind of talent to scale and sell their product globally.
Absolutely. But I was just curious, can any of you, just sort of to make it real or personal, can anyone provide a sort of personal example of stock options either enabling or preventing you from hiring a great person into a startup that you've been involved with? Just if there's anything live or just tangible there, just for anybody really.
Sure. I can jump in there. Dominic, I know I shared with you some kind of feedback from one of our key startup founders who's helped us develop, who was recently acquired by Google back in January, and a commitment that he had made was to give share options to every one of his employees, and that definitely helped attract them the right employees, leading to that acquisition ultimately. But the thing is that he had the experience of previously setting up a startup and being successfully acquired. So he personally had a lot of wealth to bring to the table, a lot of knowledge and experience, and he had the kind of investment that he could spend on professional services to actually offer that share options package. Whereas a lot of startups don't have that kind of starting point. Maybe it's their first time around. They don't have that kind of capital to spend on those kind of specialist advisory services. So that's a case in point.
Absolutely. So when you look, actually, Liz, just staying with you, with the Irish government's took steps early at the beginning of the year to try and improve the keep stock option scheme. I mean, in your view, have they done enough, or is there still more that they need to do? What's your take on that?
I think echoing Gloria's point at the beginning, there's never enough done. Once one country makes a move on something, another's going to make another move. For us, we would say there's never an end point in our journey of improving the policy environment for startups. So that's just to keep in mind. But from the Irish government's perspective, one move they did make that we had asked for was to enable part-time employees to be granted, in our case, it's keep share options. So they did that, but actually, you still have to be working 20 hours a week in order to be eligible for keep shares. And as anyone working in the startup space, for some of the most important and experienced people to bring to help you scale, oftentimes they're working less than that. So it's a case of a key point for us would be for the government to engage in a more proactive manner to really understand what are the needs and why would you need maybe a different approach to that scheme.
Yeah, and Gloria, we sort of know that historically Germany has been poor when it comes to stock options policy, and it was very exciting just hearing in the last session words from the finance ministry like hinting tantalizingly that the German government's about to make some major reforms. I mean, what from a German perspective do startups want from the government, and how confident do you feel that they can and will deliver?
Yeah, I think when you publish rewarding talent, you put it, or you showed it very clearly. We only had 10 points out of 30 possible points when it comes to attractiveness of the ESOP scheme. So the problem we always had were twofold. One, we had the issue of dry income, so you were taxed even before you got money from the exit. And the other problem is bureaucracy. because we have very strong minority shareholder rights here in Germany. So once you become a shareholder, once you exercise your option, you would, for example, be able to block a capital increase or to block an acquisition, etc., which obviously is a bit tricky. What Germans ended up doing was creating virtual share option schemes, which is basically mimicking the value of option schemes, but it's really a bonus scheme. And the problem for those is, A, you don't really feel like an owner because you are not a shareholder. And secondly, it's also taxed at income taxes plus with social contributions. So it's prohibitively expensive. We've had amazing discussions, really, really good constructive discussions over the last 2 years with the different ministries that are kind of touching that problem. I think, and more has changed in the last 2 years that has probably changed in the prior 10 years. As Jörg alluded to in the previous session, we're really confident that the government has come up with a really attractive scheme, or like for the first step towards a really attractive scheme, I would say. So what we know so far, and we don't know all the details, it's definitely going to solve the dry income problem, making it more possible to go with normal options. The two questions that still remain to be answered for us is the bureaucracy problem. So what about the minority shareholder rights? Can you actually really become a shareholder as an employee? And the other question is really the applicability that we're looking forward to solve, or to see the details on that. Meaning, is it only applicable to companies that are up to 2 or 3 or 4 years old, or is it also applicable to companies that are 10 years old? Because we want to make sure that we are not only helping companies start, but also helping companies scale. I think we now have a lot of companies that are starting, but now for me, the next 10 years is about finding enough scale-ups in Europe, not only about creating enough startups in Europe.
Yeah, and that reflects very much the data we heard earlier from Yoram about how much seed capital Europe's been successful in raising, and it's the later stages, right? So, Petrus, I'd love to bring you in at this point. So you've heard there a couple of examples of efforts in member states to bring about change. So from your perspective, why do you think there has been hesitancy to act on the issue of stock options up to now? And do you think that times might be changing now?
Well, I mean, I think I wouldn't necessarily call it hesitancy. We have a lot of good practice. And that's what we also want to highlight in the Startup Nation Standard, which I think you heard about earlier, saying that we don't have to always just look to Silicon Valley, Israel, other good examples, which we do look to, but that we have a lot of good practice here in Europe. So in the case of stock options, in your own not optional ranking, we see that Estonia is at the very top, ahead of countries like Israel and Canada even. France is right there as well, also in a very good situation, with Portugal and the UK soon behind that. And we heard already just today, which I was thrilled to hear from the Ministry of Finance, who we talk to often on various issues, that Germany is going to apparently, hopefully solve this issue, which has definitely been a bone of contention for one of the most dynamic ecosystems. So I think there's definitely movement. One issue that was raised was that perhaps the talent population in Europe, I mean, there you get a little bit of a cultural issue, is not as aware and demanding of the stock options, partially because in many cases they haven't been there, and partially because it's been difficult to take them across borders. So with this convening power, with this standard, we're hoping, along with the startup associations, with the member states, to solve this, to have a even more conducive situation for issuing the stock options. Then we can move to better collaboration on ensuring the cross-border aspects. And the last thing I would say is on the connecting ecosystems. This is something that we try to do with Startup Europe. It was mentioned as one of the things that doesn't happen always in Europe, and also on the stock options. So this best practice in the detail, not simply we have stock options, they're taxed at the time of vesting and so on, but also these issues such as minority stakeholders, minority shareholders, shareholders voting rights and so on. We can really see what works best and not just simply look to California or Israel, which are, again, useful examples, but look to our own examples within EU law.
Thank you for that. And Andres, to bring you back in, because you've been obviously very involved in efforts in Latvia to look at improving the use of stock options and treatment of stock options. So what have you found to be the biggest barrier preventing change from happening, and how have you tried to overcome that? What have you found works?
Yeah, so naturally we have the Estonians next door, and since they're top of the list, then it's our natural comparison point on everything. And so we want our startups to have the same kind of opportunities that Estonian startups do. And in fact, if you look at the Pan-Baltic picture, the Lithuanians actually have pretty attractive setup as well. And so, once we fix this in Latvia, we feel this region will in fact be showing the way for perhaps other member states. The biggest problem we've faced is simply the finance ministry's hesitation, unwillingness to actually look beyond. They're always thinking about, my next 6 months or 12 months tax revenues. Is this going to take away, well-paid corporate jobs? And there's this concern about the risks. And this difficulty for them to look beyond that with the sort of the optimist that naturally us as investors and founders have of, what the potential is, and that if you look a couple of years down the road, you could have huge windfalls, right, that are coming into the tax system, from these success stories, right, which are actually funded by, investors from elsewhere in the world, right? Because we don't, in this small region, we're not going to have, massive growth funded, investment funds. So that sort of worry is kind of clouding things. And when you're sitting in a parliamentary commission and the parliamentarians have no idea what stock options are, they've never been in business, it's very easy for a finance ministry official to scare them into, oh my God, this is going to be, a tax evasion scheme and you're going to lose tax. So this is the sort of environment you're in. And so it takes, a concerted effort by the ecosystem to push this forward. And I think the European Commission's initiative on the Startup Nation Standard is exactly the kind of thing that we need. These kind of events, this kind of standard, which is also saying it's not just the US and Silicon Valley, but right here in Europe, we have examples of how all these member states could be all benefiting from this kind of this kind of change.
Yeah, and Liz, who do you think are the most important voices? Or maybe the most important data points that you can leverage to try and get the message across, to try and get government to sit up and listen, and finance ministries to sort of become less anxious, to Andrus's point.
Well, I remember being at an event where we were encouraged how to engage with policymakers as startup representative bodies, and they shouted the words jobs, 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 jobs. And that is, always a key consideration for policymakers. Ultimately, what impact is this going to have, and in terms of providing opportunities for people. So for us, in an Irish context, in terms of jobs, it's not just a job is a job is a job. It's actually a job in a rural area. So for us, we're trying to really communicate that actually startups are well placed to provide these distributed jobs. We're now all remote, but they naturally start being quite flexible. And in Ireland, we have hugely successful startups in rural areas. So that's something that politicians are particularly keen about. But then when it gets to policymakers, so the civil service side, dealing with ministries for finance, I'm sure we could all share notes. Latvia is probably very similar to Ireland. It's their job to make sure that they're preventing loopholes from being introduced. I think that's where having very active, very honest engagement, it's not in our interest either that something happens in 3 years' time, the scheme gets shut down. So it's really making sure that they're being risk averse, but they're also enabling opportunities, and that they see that the kind of tax income that can ultimately be brought in to offset that tax lost.
Completely. And Gloria, in Germany, and hopefully on the cusp of some major changes. But there were some really quite big voices in the ecosystem that sort of we heard voicing how the importance of this issue. Do you think that made much of a difference in getting government to listen, or has it been a slower, more sort of bottom up attrition process?
I think it has helped tremendously because we really had an open dialogue. I think the ministries were always really open to engage and really listen. I think that we found it to be very constructive. And I think all of us, or probably at least most of us, were really, really constructive. So we really wanted to work alongside them and together with them to exactly avoid the loopholes, avoid creating those loopholes that could result from all of this, from the changes. So I think we've definitely had our voices heard, but it was also what was really important for us was that it was just not only 2 or 3 people standing there and fighting for it, but it was really the whole ecosystem, and really being able to collect the voices from the whole ecosystem, also through a study that we conducted where we asked about 2,000 people working in the ecosystem, not just founders, also employees, and really try to get all the voices heard, and not just those that are screaming the loudest, I would say.
Yes. And Petrus, so, I suppose if the holy grail is to have an EU-wide stock option scheme, as you say, with portability, etc., what's the role of the Commission on trying to bring that about, and what is going to be with member states? What's the interaction, or how? And I'm going to put you on the spot and say, if you had to guess how many years it might be before we might see some EU-wide scheme, how many years should we be thinking about?
Well, I mean, we have different policy and legislative tools. We can legislate, for example, recently with the Markets in Crypto Assets, the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act very soon. We can also issue policy instruments like the SME and startup policy, which has the regulatory sandboxes. We can have regulatory sandboxes, which we're setting up one with the European Blockchain Partnership. And then finally, we can convene with instruments like the Startup Nation Standard, which can lead to eventually a harmonizing regulation. But first, you should see that there are problems of fragmentation. It's necessary to say in this area, one of the most sensitive areas, and this is something that everyone has indicated Anders just moments ago, and the other colleagues, Liz and so on, that we have the tax area, which is much less easy for us to move on or to have harmonization, probably for good reason. I mean, this is an issue very close to domestic politics. So I would imagine first we start with the Startup Nation Standard. We start with everyone really trying to have the stock options as something that is seen as the best way to move forward, to have the most vital startup ecosystem. And then if we still have issues of fragmentation and a lack of harmonization, that the EU can return to this issue or a perhaps legislative instrument, but this is not something that I would predict in the near future, again, because tax policy is so much subject to domestic legislation.
So what would be your advice to people who might be listening, who are trying to bring about action and reform in their individual member states? What would you be telling them is like the sort of best way that they can push this forward and support what's happening?
Be organized through the startup associations. We have Deutsche Startups, we have Scale Up Ireland here, we have Startup LV and Tech Hub Riga. So I mean, this is the great example. I think these are in most, if not all, member states. Really talk to your legislators, your ministries. It's not always so simple as Anders mentioned, and also Liz and Gloria mentioned in various contexts. We see progress now in Germany. Hopefully we see progress in Latvia. Point out the advantages of the countries like Estonia and France and Portugal, which are known startup centers. And you can always clearly point to the European Commission, not that we're any kind of, how to say, arbiters of everything, and certainly not at all in tax policy, but that we also, based on our analysis and our evaluation of the global startup scene and scale up options, that stock options are definitely one of the ways to go forward. And it's also a fair, employee-centric way of development. So it also fits in a lot of ways the European model.
Thank you. Thank you. There's one more question I just wanted to throw in really for anybody who might have a view on this. Given the what's happening with the pandemic and COVID, etc. It's clearly causing a lot of reevaluation, but it's also and perhaps in some ways it might create openness to change and to new thinking. But it's also, as a crisis, it brings its own immediate demands and things which are more tactical. So do you think that people have a view on whether actually coming out of this crisis is a positive opportunity, or it might take things back a step because there are so many other big issues that policymakers have to deal with?
I might jump in from an Irish perspective. We've formed, along with other partners who are aligned with us, particularly around capital. Actually, for us, early stage capital is a big issue in Ireland, unlike some of the data you were talking about earlier across Europe. But we have formed the Alliance for an Innovation-Driven Recovery. And that's where I think it's a case of actually looking ahead and thinking, where is that future growth going to come from? And it's the countries that choose on that, take the time to think about that and give some headspace to looking forward, will really win out. So there is definitely an opportunity for them to really understand how to support innovation in each country, but it's whether they take the time to do that or not.
Yeah, I would second that. And I think actually for the smaller countries in Europe, in some sense, this is a bigger opportunity, because as the pandemic is accelerating the spread of remote work, distributed teams, we're certainly in Latvia. We're seeing founders come back from the US. We're seeing a definite increase in interest in building teams here, because there's now an understanding that this is not just a couple of months of lockdown and we'll be back to business as usual. There are some fundamental changes in the way things are operating, in the way customers are used to buying, and the way teams are used to running their business. And so for our countries, I think a lot of the politicians as well see this as an opportunity for startups to grow faster, to be a bigger part of the economy. So while there is pain, in our part of the economic system, it's definitely seen as something that could really help solve.
Thank you very much for that. And I think we've got to bring things to a close there. But I'd like to say thank you to all the panelists very much. And it was great to see you all again. And I hope to be able to see you all at some point soon-ish, face to face. But the next session is going to broaden this talent discussion beyond stock options to look at how else Europe's ecosystems can attract and nurture the smartest and most ambitious people that are out there. But until that starts, thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.